welcome to everyone, all the attendees who have joined us here. Today, this session with Flame University is designed to help prospective students interact with current students of Flame University who are maybe studying the subjects or disciplines that they would like to. The way it's been designed is to sort of substitute for in-person interactions that would have happened under normal circumstances. So the way that today's session is going to go is that we are joined by members of the by certain members of the student body, as well as Professor Debashish Rooj, who is, I think, the head of the economics department. And so Professor Debashish will first talk about the economics program at Flame University and give you some particulars about it. And then the different students will be talking about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on India's economy. Now, the goal of this session is to show you, to give you a hint of what your understanding of economics is likely to look like in a few years after having done the program at Flame University, and to give you a good, and also to acquaint you with the way that the program is taught at Flame. So on our panel today, we have, as I mentioned, Professor Debashish Rooj, as well as Tanmay Devi, Nandini Mehta, and Manav Lal. Professor Debashish, can you introduce our panelists and the topic of today's discussion?
Okay, thanks, Antino. So welcome everybody. So before we begin today's talking points, let me just briefly talk about the economics department and what we do in our department. And today's session is a reflection of what we do in our classes and outside the classes. So at Flame, economics department is one of the popular and sought after programs. A lot of students each year join economics either as a major or minor. So we have both the general economics program. We also have honors program that we started from last year. So we at our department level, in most of our courses, we try to imbibe both theoretical as well as practical aspects, right? So you will hear this in a lot of places, but this is what we actually practice. That you will see that in our courses we offer almost more than 25 courses, and in most of the courses there is a huge element of practical and analytical ideas that are imbibed in most of our courses. So today, three of our brightest students who are coming from different major minor combinations, they will talk about the economic scenario in this COVID world, particularly focusing on India. So we will have Nandini Mehta, who is an economics major but finance minor. On the other hand, we have Tanmay, who is a math major and economics minor, and we have Manav, who is economics major and policy minor. So they will, you can think about combining all three of them. They will have, exposure to so many different areas, not only in economics, but they are bringing the interdisciplinary understanding into their talking point today, right? So at Flame University, this is one of the major advantages of learning here, is that you will get perspectives from different angles, right? So now I think that's all. If you have from my end, if you have some questions, we can talk about that at the end of the session. But now I will hand over this to Nandini, who is going to begin the talk by looking at the understanding of the impact of COVID at individual and household level. Okay, what are the changes? What needs to be done from the micro standpoint? So over to you, Nandini.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Okay, so as sir explained, we are going to be exploring the impact of COVID-19 on the Indian economy. And as we are marking over 1 year of the existence of this pandemic, we acknowledge the social, political, and economic implications of this pandemic. And this presentation and this discussion is largely going to be focused on the economic implications that this pandemic has had on the Indian economy. And how we plan to go about it is that I'll begin by talking about the individual and household level implications, after which Tanmay will be talking about the macroeconomic, that is the countrywide implications. And finally, Manav will be talking about policy response and recovery ahead. So going ahead with the individual and household level implication, the first standpoint of conversation that I would like to look at is consumption. Before I delve into it, it is crucial to set the background for it, for which I would like to state that the Indian GDP shrunk by 23.9% in the first quarter of the financial year 2021. As is known, the Indian GDP is largely driven by private consumption, where it weighs almost 60% in the GDP. And hence, as the private consumption fell by approximately 26.7% in the first quarter, it drove the GDP down too. So what becomes important to understand here is what led to this downfall in consumption. The first thing that comes to mind is unemployment. Oh, my next slide, please. Yeah. So as we see, once the lockdown was imposed, the unemployment rate in the country jumped from 8.7% to 23.5%. And it took almost 4 months for the rate to go back to the pre-lockdown rate of 7.4% in the month of July. So as unemployment led to loss of income for a lot of households, that impacted consumption. This was the first impact. The second thing is something interesting that happened with incomes and wages in general. So in general, there were 84% of the households of the country that faced a decrease in income. And if we do if we break this down and do a little bit further of analysis, we'll see that high income households continued with more or less stable income and wages, because they tend to be employed in sectors or job profiles which were easy to translate to a work from home profile, or had the level of technological access to continue their work without suffering any losses. The low income households were also hit, but they continued operations because these households were largely employed in the primary sector, a sector which could not be given a break during the lockdown. And hence they made bare minimum income, but they still continued working. But the worst hit category was the middle income households, because these are the people who are employed in industries and job profiles which are not easy to translate to a work from home scenario, given the lack of access to technology and the job profile as such. Another disparity that was observed was that 88% of the rural households saw a fall in income, whereas 75% urban households saw a fall in income. And this disparity again exists because of the job profile differences and the lack of access to technology in the rural areas. Another thing that was interesting, this is something that I got from personal experience back at home, is the understanding of the twofold exploitation that happened in the fruit and vegetable market. There was food producer exploitation and end consumer exploitation that happened in the very initial portions of complete lockdown. So this is about the first 2-3 months of the lockdown. Farmers were exploited from the perspective that they were largely only paid floor prices, whereas they could have earned higher if there weren't a lockdown. Once the food products reached wholesalers in cities, street vendors procured food from these people at a wholesale rate and then sold it to end consumers on a street to street or a society or building to building basis at exorbitant prices, which consumers could not fight against, given that there was lack of mobility to consumers. A certain level of food producer end issue, that is the problem that was faced by farmers, was alleviated when food subsidy was introduced, but consumers continued to face exploitation until the lockdown lifting began in a formal manner. Having understood the consumer side of households and individuals, we now move to the savings and the wealth creation side of the conversation. As observed, unemployment on the rise and fall in income would lead to increased savings, and hence India was no exception to this, as households began to save more than they usually do. As a result of savings increasing, people started putting off conspicuous consumption. And when I talk about conspicuous consumption, I mean consumption or purchase of goods and services which are luxurious in nature and which are purchased either for the purpose of status symbol or not for the purpose of basic needs. So basically things that are not necessary but only consumed because they are considered a luxury item. So purchase of these was put aside and people started saving more. Another trend that was observed was that people started moving away from financial market instruments and started moving towards instruments that were considered safer, which was gold and things like that, that led to a price hike in gold, that is inflation in gold prices, which led to wealth creation despite a fall in income and wages in the households. One more thing that was interesting to observe was the attitude towards insurance that changed during this pandemic. India unfortunately had roughly only total of 20% being covered by any form of formal insurance in terms of health. This number started rising as people started realizing the amount of financial crunch that the hospital bills, given the COVID-19 pandemic, were placing on households. And as a result, there was a surge in demand for health and life insurance. This would make us think that in future the percentage will improve for India, which definitely it would. But there is also a factor that needs to be considered in terms of underwriting threshold, which will be expected to increase given that there is a high demand for insurance, and hence this would have a small pull down on the demand, but the implications and unfolding of it can only be seen with time. So having understood the micro or the individual and household level perspective of the impact of COVID-19 on the Indian economy, we now move on to understand the macroeconomic implications, which will be further explained by Tanvi.
So moving on from microeconomic implications, I will be explaining and assessing the macroeconomic effects induced due to COVID. So the first point is that the public health measures which were adopted to contain the spread and decrease the spread of the virus, it came with a cost, and those economic costs curbed consumption investment on the demand side and labor supply and production on the supply side. And then there were talks of lives versus livelihoods, which one is preferable, which suggests that there's a trade-off between the economic implication, the flattening, the COVID infection curve, and the steepening of the recession curve. So this is an illustration of the trade-off which is there. An increase in containment policies would in fact help in reducing the containment curve, infection curve. However, it comes with a cost, and therefore there was in fact negative economic growth as a result of that. So as far as the shocks were concerned to the economy, there were two kinds of shocks which have been alluded to, which are demand shocks and supply side shocks. Now, demand side shocks were majorly due to reduced investment that were caused, which was caused by increase in future uncertainty. There was fear in the market. There was fear in the market, which resulted in reduced investment, and there was also reduced consumption, which was due to wage income loss, and also demand for non-essential items had reduced because of social distancing norm and precautionary savings in the market. So this is the demand side of things, which majorly focuses on consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports. Now, moving on to supply side shocks, which were majorly caused due to disruption in supply chain linkages because of the lockdown and a lot of restrictions in mobility. And there was also inability to work from home in non-essential industries. In fact, in most of the crises that we observe, there is either a demand shock or a supply shock, or one leading to other, or one compensating for the other. However, in this case, there was a demand shock and a supply shock simultaneously. Not only this, the first order supply side disruption also potentially created second round effects of both demand and supply. And this is something what we call as a hysteresis effect. So the feedback loop generated a potential hysteresis effect, which just means that the effect of an event is not stopping even if the factors of that effect have been removed. So the hysteresis effect took place such that when household demands decreased, the profit for the individuals or profit for the firms decreased, which meant that the supply of the products decreased, and that decreased household income, which again decreases household demand. So it's a feedback loop. Therefore, there was demand shock and supply shock, which resulted in the sharp contraction of 23.9% of GDP in Q1 and 7.5% in Q2. Now, overall movement of high frequency indicators over Q1, Q2, and Q3 actually indicated that there was speedy pickup in Q2 and actually growing convergence in to pre-pandemic levels in Q3. We'll look at that later. So this is an illustration of the real GDP graph over the years. You can observe that these red shades have occurred only 4 times, and this is just the fourth contraction in India's GDP since 1960 to 1961. So majorly these have been due to droughts and wars in the past, and the major difference between the previous contractions and this is that previous contractions were majorly induced by the fact that agricultural productivity had reduced in the market. However, in this contraction, what happened was that agricultural productivity in fact acted as a cushion for the economy to grow, and manufacturing and services sector fell drastically, as we'll see further. With respect to government consumption, so with respect to the 4 factors which are there, consumption and investment fell drastically. As you can see over here, green is basically private final consumption expenditure, and gray is gross capital formation, which is nothing but the investment. Over here, exports are seen to be negative. However, it's not necessarily a good thing because these net exports were majorly due to the fact that there was a lot of contraction of imports due to COVID. And as you know, that government expenditure had increased and which supported GDP. And over here, if you will see the share of components of GDP, this is the first time in the 2000s that investment expenditure of the total GDP fell to around 26.7, approximated to 27%. Moving on to the looking at the 4 components in detail and see whether there has been a recovery or not. So these are half-yearly trends in the growth of components of GDP. Here we could see that there has been it had been hit very badly, especially consumption and investment over here. However, in the second half of the year, we can see certain improvements, and we can also see a V-shaped curve, which a lot of economists refer to as in how the recovery could take place. So the positive sign is that there has been some recovery in the second half of the year. Now, this was the demand side of things. Look, going beyond demand, we have the supply side of things, wherein we have 3 major industries: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And as mentioned earlier, agriculture was the only sector which was partially unaffected by the lockdown and which remained positive. The growth rate remained positive. However, services sector and manufacturing fell drastically, and this is the share of components of GVA is nothing but the gross value added, which is the GDP. So this is again this depicts growth in value addition for most of the sectors in our country, wherein we can see in the second half, agriculture is pegged at 3.4% only. However, other industries are seen, other sectors we can see are recovering, and most of them also have positive economic growth in the second half of the year. Now, there was a lot of talk about the shape of the recovery curve, whether it would be V-shaped, U-shaped, W-shaped. Some also think that it is a K-shaped recovery. However, the Indian Economic Survey believes that in major sectors, in major parts of the economy, there has been a V-shaped recovery, as we also saw for the half-yearly curves in the previous slide. So this is just one particular with respect to the industrial production that I would be illustrating. So in the 8 core industries over here, it was observed that in April 2020 that there was a drastic fall in the production of these core indices. However, there has been a recovery by the end of this year. And a very important index which is measured for industrial production is the Index of Industrial Production, which is IIP, which has also seen a recovery after the drastic fall in the lockdown. There had also been a lot of talk about inflation. Just to clear that out, inflation had been mainly driven by the increasing food prices and had remained above 6%, which is quite a lot, and that was due to supply disruptions. However, there has been some softening of CPI inflation by the end of the year, which falls under the target of RBI, which is 4 ± 2. And targeting inflation is a very important component for the RBI, which Mana will further focus on. So looking at the future outlook, so as to how the future could pan out, the Indian Economy Survey projects that the real GDP growth rate would increase by 11% in the current year, and the path would entail a growth in real GDP by 2.4% over the absolute level, which means that the economy would take 2 years to reach and go past the pre-pandemic levels. However, to do that, there has to be a smooth functioning of the COVID vaccine rollouts and macroeconomic measures in place. And for that, implementation is key. And to focus on the policies that could go out, Manav will take over from here.
Thank you so much, Tanmay and Nandini, for that lucid explanation and taking us through all the events. Tanmay, next slide, please. So I'll be taking us through the policy measures that have been implemented throughout COVID, and what I wish for all of us to take away from this presentation today is intuition, because that's something that you will find very common at Flame, especially given the pedagogical approach that you follow here. So the intuition here of introducing a policy when you have a crisis at hand follows in a multi-pronged manner. There are too many priorities as a policymaker that you have to address, and there needs to be a response mechanism that goes out. So purely in terms of economics, what has happened is, like what Tanmay and Nandini both have emphasized, that there are demand and supply shocks. So essentially, when there is a state of equilibrium, or just in layman terms, status quo that is maintained in terms of the economy, there is obvious disruption because of COVID crisis. Now, because there is disruption, there is an effect in your overall output, and these variables, like what Tanmay pointed out, your consumption, investment, and so on, the other macroeconomic indicators have also been affected. But when you're talking about a policy, or policies rather, the attempt of economic policies is to make sure that this equilibrium of demand and supply falls back by just tweaking around with one of these variables. And I'll be focusing more so on the government expenditure variable first, when I'll be alluding to fiscal policy. And then I will also be talking about monetary policy, like again, what Tanmay was mentioning, inflation targeting, and making sure that the economy doesn't grow at a massive rate such that it starts heating up, is what will be the focus of the entire point arguments that I want to shed light on. So very briefly, fiscal policy, making the situation better. There is a crisis at hand. The economy has taken a hit. Now, as the government, what do I do? Monetary policy, I know that there is a lot of scarcity of money, and there are other indicators that I need to take into account as the central bank of the country. So where do I step in? So we will be going through with this fiscal policy on one hand, where the government is functioning, and the central bank, the RBI. This is the intuition that I wish to build on further. On my next slide, please. So roughly going through these figures yet again, there is fluctuation in quarterly growth, as we see financial year Q3, especially of 2020. And when you see India's case, negative 23.9% as compared to the other countries, you see that how much India has been affected by the pandemic. And I'll go back to the point Nandini was making about India being a consumption-centric economy, right? A majority of the output that goes in to any economic activity is consumption-driven. And because there is a massive effect on the consumption patterns and behavior of consumers, you see that India has taken a massive hit, like the United Kingdom, like France, Italy, of course, and other countries, to name a few, but they have handled it in a better manner. So now let's come back to India. Now we go back to May 2020. Now Modi and Sitaraman come up with the economic stimulus package that is worth 20 lakh crores. That was attributed to be about 10% of the GDP, of Indian GDP. And the most important part is, of course, there was some criticism about the fact that it wasn't equivalent to what other countries, other developed economies had spent majorly. But this is what we have right now. We're operating with about 20 lakh crores. And what is the rationale here? Something which is very important to understand. When there is government policy that is coming out, the rationale here is to make sure the consumption patterns are restored to the normal level, so that the economy starts gaining pace, right? And the most effective way to do this is through
your government policy by making sure you inject something into the economy. Because there is a very simple concept that we allude to in economics jargon, which is called the multiplier effect. Essentially, if I am the government, I will be putting in about 10 rupees into the economy. And in the hope, in the assumption, which is extremely critical, in the assumption that you as consumer will be spending anything above 10 rupees. So that way I'm injecting 10 rupees, but I'm expecting you to spend about 12 rupees so that consumption starts picking up, and so does the growth rate. So that is the entire purpose of doing this. Now, you may ask me how, just by introducing some money into the economy in layman's terms, just very broadly, this is how growth happens in response to a crisis. Of course not. There are various provisions that were made. You see, when you're talking about the EPF scheme, that is the Employment Provision Fund, or when you're talking about the National Food Security Act measure that the government had taken, they provided free food and free ration to the economically weaker and vulnerable section. So the entire goal here is that by saving the income, I don't want you to keep spending too much right now. I'm going to keep making sure that I have more amount of disposable income at my end so that I can channel my expenditure in a certain manner. I want to balance out the effect such that later on, as the crisis keeps unfolding, I keep spending. And in the hope that that keeps happening, the C component in the which is the macroeconomic indicator, starts picking up and growth starts going on, right? So disposable income is one way in which you are enhancement of disposable income is one of the key goals of government policy primarily, right? Tanmay, next slide, please. Yeah. So now, what was interesting to see in this entire milieu was that the clarion call for Atmanirbhar Bharat. You have an economy that is hit real hard, and you are trying your best to stimulate demand and supply and introduce any sort of measures that will help the economy to recover. But at the same time, you send out a message of self-sufficiency, which, mind you, is a very good intention to begin with, because you're trying to set the agenda for global decoupling. And on the other hand, you're trying to recover. And the message that was trying to be instilled was that this recovery has to be by our own. We have to do it as a country and not depend on anybody else. And of course, the main reason was to protect and develop indigenous industries, mind you, because when you're in a situation of crisis, there is very little credit availability that is already there at the firms and industries end. Very, very little of it available for their disposal for normal functioning to go on. So if I have to protect and develop my indigenous industries, I had to shift the focus from becoming an import-dependent economy to becoming a more self-sufficient economy. And this is where you set the agenda for global decoupling, and you come in and say, all right, we are recovering, but now this recovery has to be by ourselves. We have to be self-sufficient. And hence, it also came in at a very pivotal time when India-China relations was severing because of the border conflict. But as of now, we have about 78 billion worth of interdependence with China. And it's more to the former, where India is a lot more dependent on China on a variety of goods. So self-sufficiency has been used as a very pivotal tool right here to make sure that we instill recovery, but making sure that there is synchrony with our indigenous industries to protect them. Now, of course, the criticism behind this was when you are recovering, it's very important to see how you're going to become self-sufficient and where you have to become self-sufficient. Because if anybody tomorrow says that India is going to be self-sufficient in manufacturing tomorrow, well, maybe, I'm not saying no, maybe, but it is still a distant dream. And that's largely because there is a lot of manufacturing equipment that we still import from various countries. And China being one of the most important importers, even in that particular scenario. So this is a very interesting thing to see. When you're recovering, there is a change in policy perception that comes in, and we see how various policies thereafter, even the MSME Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan package for the MSMEs, etc. There is a lot of talk going around it. So recovery on the one hand and policy perception on the other are propellers to see how you will tailor your policies for growth later on. Next slide, please. Now, we have alluded to fiscal policy, that is largely government expenditure, but is that enough in itself? Remember, we started by saying that there are two facets of this policy making when it comes to the economy. One is fiscal and the other is monetary. So both of them need to move in tandem. And that is why when we look at monetary policy, Tanmay, next slide. Yeah. We have to see what the central bank is doing. In our case, the Reserve Bank of India. And here is what is happening right now. Crisis has unfolded. Probably there is a major drop in employment rates on that very day. And you see when there is a drop in employment rate, like the graph Nandini had shown, that means that there is lesser income available to you. And what you're going to do to relieve this a little bit, you want to make sure that whatever income you've possibly lost, the central bank comes in and relaxes certain rules and regulations to make sure, all right, let's pump in money, because there are consumers who are suffering and they don't have too much of money. So essentially, probably what is used and saved in the bank may be available right now to the consumers because of certain introduction of the RBI's policies, which I will come to a little later. But here, this entire thing of making sure that you pump in more money to the economy such that there is more liquidity available is called an expansionary monetary policy. Sole objective is to increase your money supply. But now, if I have money supply and I keep withdrawing from my bank, let's say, for example, and I keep spending how much ever money I want, all right, demand is picking up, consumer consumption levels are getting restored. What is a high probability in this scenario? Like what, again, I'll go back to what Tanmay was saying. Prices keep picking up. Why do prices keep picking up? Let's go to our basic framework of demand and supply, right? And because of this increased demand now, your prices are also picking up, as a consequence of which there is inflation. So now when the central bank sees what is exactly happening, they want to suck up all the money, and they want to see that, okay, I'm going to just suck up some money so that consumers reduce their expenditure. And now my consumption levels are restored such that my inflation targets are met with. Remember, Tanmay was mentioning about inflation targeting. So essentially, the expansionary monetary policy, when would the RBI implement it? You must be so confused right now when I said, okay, you have expansionary and contractionary policies. Expansionary would be just at the onset of the outbreak, would be at around March. And when consumption started picking up, say in about October, November, perhaps, that would be the time where they would probably have alluded to contractionary monetary policy. So how do they do these things? Expansion. How do they inject money and just suck out money as and when they please? It's not that simple. There are certain open market operations, like we call it in economics, that the RBI may conduct, or they tinker around with certain interest rates, such as the cash reserve ratio or the statutory liquidity ratio, which I don't intend to bombard you all with as of now. But there are certain policy instruments that the RBI exercises. I'll just give you a small example. For example, if the RBI were to introduce money into the economy, then they are going to keep purchasing certain government bonds. All right, thereby they're going to stimulate the economy with more amount of money. Conversely, when they ought to suck back the money, they tinker around with a few interest rates. One of the most common ways they do this is by perhaps increasing the cash reserve ratio. And again, I don't want to get into specifics of it, but this amount of intuition is fine to just know what sort of policy mechanisms are available at the RBI's disposal. All right, Tanmay, next slide. So what do we learn? Now, like I said, we have to keep building on our intuition. And as and when some of you, should you choose to come to Flame, you would realize the importance of building that intuition, because right here, we've just connected the real life scenario with certain economic concepts. And the first point itself on the screen, economic stimulus package, is basically a part of the government expenditure, the equation that we had alluded to earlier. And we covered that part through the multiplier effect. When the government invests certain amount, the intention is that as a consumer, I spend more, such that there are corrective measures in the economy. But now, what is also important is that I need to keep taxpayers and companies happy. And we also, so through the economic stimulus package, there were also various provisions of reducing the TCS and TDS. Now, tax deduction scheme and tax collection. Now, why were these reduced? Because they also contribute to having significant amount of disposable income available to you. And just by logic, we can say, right, the minute the tax is reduced, the assumption is that we have a little more income available and we'll probably spend. And so times of crisis, you want to ease consumer uncertainty. And that is why you want to take such measures to increase money supply and make sure disposable income is also there. And when the economy starts heating up, quote unquote, which is synonymous to there being inflation, you pull the plug. And my personal opinion out of all of this has been that as much as economic stimulus packages have helped, they've only addressed one half of the problem, and that is supply side injections. Supply side injections, unfortunately, have not been adequate in penting up demand. You have to ensure that there is, as much as I am supplying money to you, probably tomorrow as a business, I'm getting that money, all right, fine. You're reducing your taxes, wonderful. But if my business is not going to have any demand in terms of consumers not coming to buy anything from me, then that is going to be a problem. So there was a little more emphasis that needed to be given to the demand-driven side of it. So yeah, that concludes the policy responses as well. I hope this was intuitive enough. And over to you, Devasith sir.
Yeah, thanks to all three of you. So before we begin our Q&A session, there is already a question. I think Rishabh has asked a question. So is Pallavi, can we allow Rishabh to ask this question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I don't see Rishabh. Oh, yeah. Rishabh, we have allowed you to speak. Can you please raise your question?
Yes, ma'am.
So Rishabh, right? It's an excellent question. So I would like you to,
Yes,
yes.
Yes.
Explain your
So
question.
what I wanted to ask was, yes. So during the pandemic, like during the last year, when everything came to a standstill, people started to save more because they were being precautious about the future. So the decline in GDP, did paradox of thrift, was it a reason for the decline anyway? Like, was this an effect for the GDP to decline when people started to save more and more?
Should I take that question? Yeah, all right. Thank you for your question, Rishabh. That's a very good question. Now, like I said, the entire attempt is when you are willing to save a lot more, it becomes obvious that that amount you're putting to saving and not for consumption, right? So what happens is, as we saw, that consumption is an integral part of the contributing to the entire output of a country. So as soon as that same income that you could probably have used for consumption is saved, that portion of consumption that is possibly that could probably be utilized is directly sucked away, and therefore it can have an impact on your aggregate economy. So your entire output, since India is also a mainly consumption driven economy,
it does have massive implications. And if I may indulge with another technical sort of a thing in economics, what we call marginal propensity to consume, just to cut everything short and tell you in a very layman sort of a language, is that your marginal propensity to consume declines as and when you just start saving, because you don't have that sort of money that is available, and what you would probably want to put in would reduce, and hence it has an aggregate effect on the output. So I hope I've answered the question.
And just to quickly add on to that, paradox of thrift is just a concept. It doesn't cause anything. So it is a paradox because what it states is that as savings increase, aggregate demand in the economy falls. However, savings are perceived to be good for the economy. And those are good in the long run, provided that those savings are injected in the economy in the form of investments. But at this point, what happened was there was a lot of precautionary demand for money, and that resulted in increased savings. However, that did not translate into increased investments, and that's why this resulted in fall in aggregate demand.
Excellent. So any follow-up question from anybody?
So if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I want to show. So I mean, the answer lies in whatever you have presented actually. So if you can just pull up your first slide, I think. Yeah, so the first page itself. Yeah, just okay. This is the opening page, but just first slide. Yeah. Next. Okay. No. Fourth one.
Tanmay, the first slide for my part.
Yes. Yeah. Consumption. So this is what I mean. You should be looking at. Okay, no, not this one. Okay. Right. So paradox of Thrift, as Tanmay has rightly pointed out, it's that okay, when savings increases, what happens? You're going to consume less. So if you consume less, you can see that aggregate demand is going to fall. Now, aggregate demand is nothing but the output, right? So that output is going to fall. And if output falls, then obviously savings will once again fall, right? So what is the paradox? Paradox says that you are trying to increase saving, but that ultimately leads to decrease in saving. But whether we have encountered that kind of a situation is too early to say, because it's a process through which this is going to work, right? So okay, demand has fallen, savings has gone up because of precautionary motive, but you will also see that precautionary motive is going down slightly. Even in this economic survey, there is a nice graph that talks about that. Okay, how people with smaller amounts of money, particularly in Jan Dhan account, where they have now started taking out money. So obviously savings went down, but it is slightly going up. Now, whether there is a lot of interplay of different variables that are that act in economic scenarios, right? So you only that when savings are going up, whether that is translating into enough loss in aggregate demand, and whether economy is going to, how much economic recovery happens, there's a lot of time lag that is going to come into play. So we do not know, but it could be possible. Like there are certain indicators, high frequency indicators could lead towards that, right? So it's too early to say. But if you look at what the IIP data that was released yesterday, you see that the IIP actually contracted during last month by 1.6%, right? Whereas inflation pressure is like inflation went up. So what is going to happen to the final outcome? As Tanmay has pointed out, that it might take 2 years to come back to that initial situation. So we do not know unless we have more data. Maybe after another data, we have another 2 quarters of GDP data, or at least 4-5 months of IIP data. We will not be able to say conclusively that okay, there is paradox of thrift, right? So it's too early to say. We need to base our understanding based on data. Okay.
Sir, actually, I asked this question because last year we, like in our 12th standard, we studied about the paradox of thrift. But then in such a huge crisis like pandemic, I never read it in the newspapers or anywhere like as a concern. So I just wanted to know if it had affected the GDP, if that.
Yeah, so it's so excellent. Like, I really appreciate like the way you are thinking. It's an indication that you are going to be a very good, economic students. And like, if you are joining Flame next, I mean, I would be very happy. Like, probably you'll be in my class or somebody else's class. So you can really take up this as a project. I mean, we encourage our students, to think differently, think about current problems, link it with like, what is the idea? That idea is that, okay, whenever we are talking about any theory in the class, can you really link it with the real life? So if we are explaining paradox of things, it's an excellent thing to think about itself, that okay, whether this is happening in today's scenario, not in India, probably it can happen to any other country. So it's worth exploring. And I mean, and that is what the approach that we take at Flame, that okay, it's a research based, we try to find the answers to the questions that comes forward in front of us from various platforms. And it's really, I really appreciate your thinking. So any questions, any other questions from anybody else?
Thank you, Professor Debashish, for answering it live. In fact, participants, anybody else, if you want to ask any question, we can allow you to speak and you can ask a question to any one of our panelists. So by the way, I mean, till the time our participants are really opening up a few more relevant questions, I see it's a very good panel today. Like Manav is, I think, economics with public policy. Nandini is with economics and finance. Tanmay is with applied maths and econ as a major minor combination. So either Professor Debashish or maybe any one of our speakers today from the students fraternity, can you tell us something about this interdisciplinary education experience at Flame? This comes to my mind from various questions and the explanations to different, whatever. Manav is laughing, I don't know why, but Manav, how do you look at it, like economics as a major and say public policy as a minor? I have been interacting with Tanmay quite a lot, and I know how it works and what was his thought process essentially to take maths as a major and econ as a minor. But maybe Tanmay, Manav and Nandini, if you can.
Sure. At the onset, I must say that I'll be biased while saying this because of the fact that I have that much of a liking towards economics and public policy at large. But what I largely felt was that economics and public policy, both this combination captured the very essence of what interdisciplinarity meant, because public policy in itself is a very interdisciplinary subject in itself. So having that sort of multifaceted exposure and coupling it with economic perspectives, especially in your third year when you come to learn of development economics. Now is the time where I can tie in everything that I've learned at Flame for the past 3 years from various courses and tie it with one subject. And I can do the very same when I'm going for my public policy courses. And I'll just take 30 seconds and say this here, that sort of data exposure that you get with economics as a program, especially through econometrics and macroeconomics courses, they give you that sort of edge over the other students to visualize data, etc., and put it in perspective of policy, which is very important because, like we went through the entire macroeconomic situation, it's ultimately all numbers, graphs, etc. And for me to come to the stage of where I want to formulate a policy, all that preliminary analysis is very important. So I think, at least for me, it's a sweet spot to be in, where I'm exposed to the policy side of it. I know I'm also seeing the quantitative side unfolding with a mix of everything.
Thanks, Manav. That was really well explained. Nandini?
Yeah. Hi. So as ma'am mentioned, I am an econ major and a finance minor. And for me, this year especially has been really great in terms of the way the courses kind of blend into each other. I could really see how economics became a base to describe a lot of financial movement, because there's higher volatility in the financial education in terms of the timeline that you look at in terms of short term and long term as compared to what we look at in economics. So the idea that economic theories are becoming a base to explain a lot of financial movements, a lot of financial concepts is something that my mind just completely opened up to, and I was thrilled to understand how those two disciplines intermingled and how one complements the other, and the existence of one without the other is absolutely not possible. So the idea of drawing a very thin boundary between these two subjects and also understanding the intermingling of these two subjects has been one of my greatest takeaways from the program. And I think both the subjects help me understand each other better. Like things coming from finance help me understand economics better. And definitely most of the economic theories that I can visualize even in financial theories help me understand my finance courses better. So I think this entire nexus of the two subjects or the two areas of study has been very helpful for me, especially given that I am looking at a corporate sector sort of job profile, and wherein both of these courses understanding is equally important to succeed. So yeah, this experience has been very interesting for me.
Okay, all right. I think that's the beauty of experience. I mean, that's the beauty of interdisciplinary learning approach, which comes with liberal education. Tanmay, anyway, you want to add up something?
I think they covered most of it. I just wanted to say that, so in economics, there's a lot of theory which we learn in, let's say, 11th and 12th. However, over here, it's truly looking at application and going over data, as Manav said, is very important. I just feel that theory, it feels that after a point that it's a bit superficial, but when you delve into the data and when you know more on that, I think it's a deeper learning.
Okay.
That gives a broadened approach.
All right. Thank you, Tanmay, Manav, and Nandini. Anybody from participants wants to add something or wants to speak about something or have a question for our panelists today? I think we have allowed you to speak. Anybody wants to have any further clarification? As I said, Professor Devashish, maybe till the time our participants are opening up, one typical question which we always come across when we deal with these students who are actually on the verge of finalizing their admission with us is that what is the difference between economics as a major area of specialization versus economics as an honors program? I mean, we offer both the programs. So this is a typical question which we generally come across. So maybe if you would like to add something on this, please.
Yeah, so I think you will end up taking similar kind of courses, either if you are in economics honors or economics major, or something minor like public policy or math and finance. But economics honors is a more rigorous program compared to economics major minor, a plain BA in economics. So the differentiating fact is that your entry level cutoff is going to be higher for economics honors students, right? So you need a higher GPA at the end of your third term in your first year.
Yes.
So you have to be really you have to really work hard to get into the economics honors. Right, just entering FLAME is not enough to get into economics honors program. So that entry level barrier is there, so that it's because it is more rigorous. It is plain that it is not for everybody. It is only for those students who really want to push themselves further into that area. And obviously you also need another entry point is that you need math at 11-12. Okay, so that is a mandatory condition. You can get into a BA program without having math in your 11-12. The third factor is that the number of courses that you're going to take in economics honors is I think around 10, or at least three courses are you have to take 3 more courses than a regular program, which one of them is a dissertation. So undergrad dissertation is not compulsory for economics, the BA program, plain BA program, but for economics honors program, undergrad dissertation is a must. So you have to work on that aspect. So you're basically that's what you are going to do in your third year.
Sure.
Most of your courses are going to either come from math, finance, and some courses from public policy as well as EVS. So it's a mix of you have to take all the econ courses, think about that, and take some courses from each of the interdisciplinary areas that is primarily linked with economics. So in a nutshell, that's how we can differentiate between economics and economics.
Okay. Anybody wants to add up here? Nandini, you want to add something?
No, I think Sir's covered everything, but there was one question in the Q&A about having an econ minor with a BBA major. So yes, you can have, say, the reverse of my combination, for example. So you could have a finance major with an econ minor. That is possible. So that's doable at Flame, yeah.
Amongst the
so
participants.
One more, just one thing.
Sure, please.
Yeah, just to add to what Nandini has, because Nandini is here. More questions that we generally get is that's one of the other questions that is quite gas. And Nandini is a perfect example who didn't have maths in 11 and 12, but took all the math courses in first year, and she is I think if you look at her GPA, it's one of the top 5 percentiles in Flame, right? So you do not think that if you didn't have math background, you cannot succeed in any of the Flame programs, right? So, or particularly in economics or in other areas. So that's possible with the curriculum and the pedagogy at Flame, right? So you can be assured about that.
Correct. So we have just 2 more minutes left in case anybody wants to know a little more from our speakers today. In fact, just to add here, this was specially arranged for a very closed group of students who recently completed the selection process at Flame successfully. And as Shantanu explained in the beginning, it's the time when all of us are working from home. I don't know what time probably you can visit the campus. So this was an opportunity for you to interact with some of your seniors, some of your peers. That's the reason this platform was created. And of course, in addition to the kind of knowledge which we wanted to, like, it's a part of our knowledge exchange series as well. Anybody from participants? Otherwise, we would like to close the session because we have another session lined up at 6:15 sharp.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, yes, Siddharth, sure.
So my question is to Manav, and firstly, I want to say, pardon me if I interpreted what you said in a different way. You said that India being a manufacturing hub may be a distant dream, but a lot of companies like Tesla and Apple are investing into India, setting up their production units. And I think yesterday there was a deal or project about USA, Japan, Australia, and India coming together to tackle the COVID-19, where India is set to produce, I think, 1 billion vaccines. I'm not sure about the numbers. So don't you think the world is perceiving India to be a manufacturing hub?
That's a very good question. Yeah, especially since you took the example of the quadrilateral dialogue. That gains utmost importance because India's position in the global, in terms of global economic standing now, has started changing. Earlier there used to be a thing that if you want more resilient markets and supply chains, China is your answer with conducive labor laws, but it is turning out to be India as well. So you're absolutely right. When you say that the world is perceiving India to be the next manufacturing hub, but above and below the perception, what is more important is whether or not India has the capacity to match up or ramp up their capacity to manufacture as well as probably China does, or even any other capital intensive countries. Because if you're talking about being a manufacturing hub, that's a different story altogether, because Tesla, Apple, GE, and the likes moving to India is just more of a statement, in my opinion, of India being an option, India being a more reliant option as compared to China, given their belligerence, if I may call it so, in various ways in the South China Sea and recently even with India. So the shift towards India is definitely as an option, But and moreover, when I said that it's a distant dream, it's more about it's not just about the capacity, but where India will find its raw materials from to get a finished product. Because if you're talking about most of the manufacturing products, even in the automobile sector, and probably you can refer to the works of Anant Krishnan, who's written as a book on India's China Challenge, which offers really racy insights. And he takes a specific example of Reliance being one of the biggest industries in India that is into various, specifically the telecom industry. And Huawei happened to be one of the highest importers to Reliance itself to get their finished products in place and set up various telecom projects. So, like I said, so even if you're trying to become the next manufacturing hub, capacity is one thing, and your global decoupling, such that you can rely on your indigenous industries to deliver those products, is going to be extremely important. So yes, I'm not saying it's impossible, because I would definitely share everybody's enthusiasm about India becoming the next manufacturing hub, and for that matter, being the next manufacturing miracle of probably Asia. But it is definitely going to be challenging. It is going to be long term. But as an economist, and as a budding economist, rather, I must say that we don't allude to terms as long term and short term. But I'm saying that I'm optimistic about it, and hope that they are able to develop policies and have a more conducive industry environment that can help set up a manufacturing hub in India. Yeah, good question.
I think
You're on mute, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Manav, for answering it so well. I think we have a question coming in from Aditya. Maybe I would request Professor Debashish to answer it live. It's then maybe we can come to an end of the session.
Yeah, Aditya, I really appreciate your question. This is an interesting question, and it's very close to my heart. I think all the three students are nodding. So I have discussed this in my class, and there is an article on this that I wrote, I think almost a year ago. You can see on my LinkedIn page that I strongly believe that freedom, which means you are talking about obviously the democratic processes, right? And the way you see that our institutions are being undermined in such a way that it is in the long run not in the interest of anybody, especially if you look at economies prosper when you are free to express. Okay, innovation, one of the major drivers of economic growth, long-term economic growth, is innovation. And you can only innovate only when you have the freedom of everything, right? You have freedom of thinking, freedom of expressing those things. So if you read economic survey, this year's economic survey, there is a whole section on the role of innovation, and you will find a huge amount of literature that talks about that why democracy and protecting the institutions are so important in leading those innovations. So if you have to now think about in a diagrammatic way, right, from freedom to innovation, innovation to economic growth, you will find that answer yourself. So I think your question is quite pertinent, and I take a strong view on that. Okay, that it is important.
Yes. I think, I mean, of course, if we are on this platform, I'm sure we will have more interesting questions coming in, but time is limited. As I said, we have a next webinar scheduled at 6:15. So thank you all the participants, and a very big thank you to all our students, especially Nandini, Manav, and Tanmay. Look forward to have such kind of webinars done with you maybe in the next couple of months to come up. Thank you, Professor Debashish, to bring a student cohort together who probably could speak on various issues. Thank you so much, all the participants. Looking forward to all of you in the next webinar too. Thank you.